you doing, everybody? Welcome to the Rule the Wasteland podcast. This is Eric, aka the Lord Humongous from RuleTheWasteland.com. This podcast is going to be about your prepping or preparedness strategy, what different kinds of strategies there are, and how that can and should structure your preparations and your decision-making dealing with your preparations. And this is an area that a lot of people have not really put a lot of time and effort into thinking about or figuring out, and it's something that can make a big difference when it comes to how much you spend your resources on for prepping and preparedness, what you spend your resources on, and just basically coming up with a much more effective, much more coherent overall preparedness strategy. And making sure you know what your own strategy is very important, because a lot of people don't even know. I mean, they have a general idea that they want to be prepared for pretty much anything, but they don't really have a strategy for doing that. So then they're, all the resources they put into that, whether it be time, money, whatever, is just willy-nilly and doesn't necessarily get them closer to that goal because they don't really know what that goal is. When your goal is too, obtuse, like I want to be prepared, that's sort of like when the government says they want to end terrorism or the war on terrorism. You can't really end these things, and you can't really just be prepared for everything. So it's very important to have a specific strategy that you can look back on. Basically what they call in the military a leader's intent. So even if you're not able to get a direct order from your superiors, if you know what their specific intent is, then you can come up with what you would need to do because you have an overarching mission goal or mission statement. So I think mission statement is probably the best way to describe it. A strategy or mission statement for your preparedness is the best way for most people to think about it. And that way, when you're looking at whether you should have, solar panels or what type of water purification technique you should use, all those things, you can look back at your mission statement or your strategy and find out what you should do. And it makes it so much more simple, and you can save a lot of time and effort by doing this. So without rambling too much, I'm going to get into the different types of plans or strategies, different types of mission statements. They'll just be general categories, and what you come up with will be specific to your desires, your situation. Then the second point is why it matters, which I've covered a little bit already. But I'll get into some of the problems that can be avoided by having a coherent strategy or mission statement. And then I'm going to just give a few brief examples on what you can do to prepare, things that you should do for the different kinds of strategies or mission statements. So basically, these are not all created equal either. There are certain types of strategies that I think are better, but what you decide to do is on you. Like I said, my main mission statement is to improve my life. That's mine. So if it gets to a point, there's a lot of things that I'm not really that well prepared for, technically speaking, because I think they're low chance of occurring, or for various other reasons, trying to get prepared for them decreases my quality of life more than not being prepared for them. So that's just one way to think about it. So my mission statement, if I had to write it out in one sentence, would be to be as prepared for future events as possible to maintain my current lifestyle without decreasing at all, to improve my lifestyle and simultaneously prepare for current events. That's pretty much it. I haven't really sat down and worded it perfectly before, and maybe I'll do that for a blog post or something like that. So what's your different strategies? There's a couple different types of plans. One would be to prepare for a set amount of time. I want to have general preparedness set away for 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, 6 months, whatever. There's other people who plan for a specific type of disaster, like, I'm hurricane preparedness, I'm preparing for economic collapse, I'm preparing for a coronal mass ejection or something like that. I don't think this is ideal because in the Survival Podcast, Jack Spirko has covered the fact that a lot of disasters is what's called the commonality of disaster, or that's what he calls it anyway. And by preparing for one, you prepare for all disasters. So it would seem like that wouldn't be a bad strategy, but it's almost the inverse. Because they're so common, you want to just make sure you have general preparedness covered, and you'll automatically be prepared for 90% of any given disaster. And then if you have a particular concern or whatever after that, then you can address it, but I don't recommend directly just preparing for a specific disaster, because that's not preparing for you. That's not preparing for your life. That's preparing for something in the future. That's basing your decisions on avoiding negative emotions. What you want to do is base your decisions on chasing positive emotions. Seems like a subtle difference, but it's not. I'll make a podcast on that later probably, because that's really pithy. You can get into that a lot. It's a mindset thing that makes a big difference. So you could do a set amount of time, you could do a set disaster, or you could, the third option is you could try to do a predetermined level of self-sufficiency or reach some level of self-sufficiency. Like, I want to provide, a certain number of food or whatever, a certain amount of my own water or whatever. Of these, for most people, of these 3 decisions, I think that preparing to be prepared, basically, or trying to be prepared for a set amount of time, self-sufficient for a set amount of time, I think is the best and most appropriate strategy. Because let's face it, even those of us out there who are hobbyist preppers are really interested in it as a topic and are just not really either logistically prepared or even desire trying to be completely self-sufficient and living that lifestyle. And that's what it is. It's a lifestyle change. So I wouldn't focus on self-sufficiency unless that's something that you're already interested in for just your own life, your own choices, not just for preparedness purposes. Because you can be prepared in other ways fairly well without disrupting your life. And like I said, for me, it's about making my life better. So living in the middle of the woods and being 100% self-sufficient, while I would be way, way more prepared, I'm not going to enjoy my life more than I would doing it another way. So that's my goal. So mostly we're going to focus on the set amount of time, preparing for 30, 60, 90, 180 days. Anything longer than 180 days, maybe a year, and you're basically getting into the self-sufficient territory anyway. Because to prepare for anything longer than 6 months simply by storing stuff, you're going to be a hoarder. You're going to have lots of space, lots of waste due to stuff going bad, constantly be cycling things out and checking things for wear and tear and rot and all that stuff. And it's just not, storing things is just not a viable strategy for longer than 6 months to a year. Anything beyond that, to really have it work, you're going to need to go into self-sufficient homesteading type situation. So we're going to focus on set amount of time. So next up is why it matters. I briefly got into this in the very beginning of this podcast. The main reason is there are decisions you can make that would be different depending on what your strategy is, whether you're preparing for a set amount of time, for a set disaster, or for self-sufficiency. You're not going to do things the same way. If you're preparing for self-sufficiency, it's very unlikely that you're going to pack a bunch of rice into barrels, 300 pounds of rice, packed away with oxygen absorbers and whatnot. It obviously would make sense to have a little bit of food on hand, but if you're trying to create a self-sufficient homestead type situation, you're not going to be relying on just having big stockpiles of items. And the same thing, if your plan or your strategy is to be prepared for 30 days, it doesn't make any sense to stockpile 17 pairs of boots or, 100 tubes of toothpaste, because there's no way you could use all those within 30 days. And the type of disasters that are going to occur that would lead you to need your preparations for 30 days or less are just not going to be the type where you would need long-term supplies or have to deal with things like bartering or have to deal with things like planting crops. So there's no point in having seeds and all these other things if your strategy is for 30 days. And that's perfectly fine to have that strategy. It would put you ahead 99.9% of the population, maybe even more, to have 30 days worth of preparation squared away. And I can tell you that most things in history, certainly most things in modern history, you would severely elevate your chances of surviving and thriving if you had 30 days of resources just socked away. Certainly, and then when you start getting into the 60, 90, 180 days, you will be very well prepared for almost everything. But that still determines what you're going to be doing, because like I said, you may not justify the cost of drilling a well in your backyard if your goal is 30 days of preparedness. You could certainly store 30 days of water. You're also not going to probably have to worry about things like laundry and stuff as much if you're only focused on 30 days as you would if you're focused on 6 months, because you're just not going to deal with these issues. And there's no point in trying to deal with some of the issues for 60 days or 90 days and some for 30, because once those resources run out, it doesn't matter if you can do laundry for a year if your water runs out after 30 days. So it's perfectly fine to prepare for only 30 days, but just make sure that's guiding your decision making. That's guiding your strategy. So if you want to be prepared for 30 days, do everything towards that goal. It's perfectly fine. Just make sure your decisions are actually supporting that initial strategy. So that's what I recommend. I think that you guys should pick a time frame that makes sense to you. And don't worry about not seeming like a real prepper or anything. This is your life. These are your decisions. If it's just a hobby, that's fine to admit that. If you think that the world is 100% going to have a drastic shit hit the fan scenario within the next few years, it's perfectly fine to think that as well, as long as it's based on your decision making. No decisions or actions should be automatic. They should be based on you making an actual decision. It shouldn't be fear-based or anything like that. So if that's what you think is going to happen based on your research, then make the strategy and back it up with your day-to-day decision-making too. Make it a coherent strategy. And whatever you choose to do, that's fine, but do it right. So now I'm going to get into a little bit about how you can effectively prepare for each of these situations based on what your choice of strategy might be. So we'll start with the set time. So say you wanted to be prepared for a set amount of time, 1 month, 2 months, 6 months, whatever. If you have water, you're probably gonna go with storing water, because no matter what your preparation is, I should have covered this a second ago, you're gonna need water, food, energy, and supplies, just general supplies. But basically, you're gonna need water, food, energy source, and general supplies, whether you're preparing for a set amount of time, for a specific disaster, or a specific level of self-sufficiency. You're going to need those things. So for water, if you're preparing for a certain amount of time, you find out how much water you would need on a day-to-day basis, multiply that by the number of days that you're planning on preparing for, and then find out what the best way is to probably store that water. For a month or 2 months, maybe even 3 months, I would just go with straight up storing water. And you're probably not going to need much beyond drinking water, cooking water, and a little bit of bathing water. Certainly in a disaster that only lasts 30 days, you're probably not going to be taking or need to take that many showers anyway, once or twice a week. Taking a little, wiping off the sponge bath or whatnot would be sufficient. If you want to go longer than that, you may want to look at a different water source. Something like a well or larger tanks or a nearby water source would probably be necessary if you're trying to go 6 months or more with water, because then you're going to get into needing a lot more water for showering. You're going to need water for washing your clothes a few times. You're going to need water for cooking and drinking like that too. Make sure to include your pets and animals and everything in any of your calculations. Food, same thing. Find out what you need on a day-to-day basis. Multiply that by how many days you're trying to prepare for, whether that's 1 day or whether that's 365 days. And then figure out a way to make it last that long. For 30 days, you're not going to have to do much beyond making sure you have a little bit extra of everything and cycling it out. You're probably not going to have to do any long-term food storage. If you're preparing for 30 days, you're not going to have to stick stuff in buckets of rice with O2 absorbers. That's probably true up to even 90 days. Most foods, not fresh foods, will last, a while, as long as it's not fresh meat and fresh vegetables, which you're probably not going to want, because otherwise you'll be relying on your fridge, which is not the best idea. The whole point of being prepared is to be able to do without the things that you're using on a day-to-day basis. So expecting the power to be on is probably not a smart choice. So food, you just multiply by that, find out which ones will last, keep those, find out the things that wouldn't last, and create substitutes for those. So maybe some powdered milk or something like that, a little bit on hand. And if you need eggs, maybe some powdered eggs, the stuff that lasts, like canned goods or dry goods like rice and beans, just buy more of those and cycle through it. Use the oldest first in, first out kind of thing. The stuff that you bought longest ago, use that, and then buy more, so you always have a static amount sitting in your house that's enough to sustain you for 30 days. Energy. For 30 days, you may be able to forego a lot of things in this category. All you really need to do to be prepared for 30 days is have enough energy to cook and maybe a few flashlights and stuff like that. You could certainly survive off batteries for flashlights or some oil lanterns and stuff like that for 30 days. You're not going to need to get into any extreme power sources like outfitting your house with solar or anything like that if you're focused on only 30 days. If you're focused on 6 months or more, then maybe you want to start looking at solar, storing a little bit of gasoline, maybe having a generator and things like that. You can have propane grill for cooking and maybe store enough in a tank to last you for 6 months, maybe even a year, if you want to get a tank installed at your house or your homestead or whatever you want to do. Supplies, that goes into, just like I was saying with the food, the water, and the energy. Find out what you need on a day-to-day basis, what you would burn through or use up within a 30-day, 60-day, or 90-day period, and make sure you have extras of those or substitutes for them. Remember, not everything do you have to just have a extra sitting in your house. You want to also look at opportunities to be able to do without those or substitute them for something else. So don't just buy 7 of everything you use on a day-to-day basis because you just might not need that, or there might be better, cheaper ways to be prepared for not having that in the event of a shit-hit-the-fan situation. So for 30 days, you probably don't have to worry about extra clothing. Your clothing should last 30 days, even in a heinous situation where you're doing a lot of crazy manual labor or something like that and just clothes getting filthy. Most of us have enough clothes to last 30 days, even if you're wearing a new shirt every day. People in America have a lot of extra clothing, so that shouldn't be a problem. Another one would be hygiene supplies. Make sure you have enough hygiene supplies for 30, 60, 90 days or whatever you're expecting to go. Make sure everything lines up too, like I was saying before. No point in having 6 years worth of shaving cream if you only have 1 extra pack of razors, you know what I mean? So, and again, for the shorter time frames, like 30 and 60 days, you can probably get away with batteries and having battery-powered razor or shavers or razors and things like that, because you'll only be doing it once a week, maybe twice a week, and a couple extra set of batteries will prepare you for that just fine. For 6 months to a year, you're probably not going to want to store a huge pile of batteries. Now you're going to want to start looking into other sources of replacements for those, maybe short little manicuring scissors, or straight razors and other things that last a long time, and that may be an option there. For longer than that, then you just have to look at how long the things that you use last. There's no point in coming up with what-if situations and getting quote-unquote replacements for stuff that you don't really use now anyway. You know what I mean? So don't try to come up with scenarios where you might need something, because you could do that with anything. I don't care what the item is. I could come up with a scenario where you might want to have that. And that's just a futile effort that will end up with you being a massive hoarder. So that's one of the advantages of having a strategy like this. It enables you to break free from that mindset of, oh, well, I could use that if this happens. Or, oh, well, if this happens, I might need that. Because you look at your strategy and say, well, my strategy is to be prepared for 30 days of survival. There's no point in storing 18 gallons of liquor to barter with in Bartertown when my strategy is to be prepared for 30 days of self-sufficiency. It just doesn't make any sense. So it allows you to make those decisions. Next up, if we go into specific disasters, you're still going to need water, food, energy, or supplies, but you may not need all of those depending on what you're preparing for. Now, like I said, I don't recommend this as being the best strategy, because I think if you're preparing for a certain amount of preparedness, you might as well take every category up to that level. So if you're preparing for, economic collapse, you may be preparing for job loss and things like that, but not really worried about the utilities going out, depending on how severe you think the economic collapse may be. If you think it's just going to be a massive depression or something, then you may not think that there will be infrastructural problems. If that's your choice, that's fine. Just make sure all your decisions align with that. But like I said, I think it's better to just go ahead and prepare in every area. Might as well. That way you're not stuck in a situation like I mentioned before where you'll have a bunch of toothpaste or whatever, but no water or whatever. So you could do that. But if you're looking for a specific disaster like an earthquake, there may be items that you would want for supplies that you don't need for any other disaster. And you're also probably not going to be worried about having anything more than maybe a week's worth of supplies, because the earthquakes are localized events. You're not going to be without aid or ability to leave or whatever for more than a few days, probably, unless you're trapped in the rubble or something. So it's going to be totally different if you're preparing for an earthquake or a tornado specifically versus just being prepared for anything for 30 days. And it's very easy to take a general 30-day preparedness kit and add on the little extra things that you would need for a hurricane or whatever than it is to take hurricane preparedness and say, oh crap, now all of a sudden I need preparedness for 30 days of no grid being active or something like that. So that's why I recommend not preparing for the disaster. But if that's your thing, if you're just saying my only fear is these specific scenarios and you just want to prepare for those, then just go through the whole thing. Water, how would this event disrupt my water, and what would I need to do to prevent that? How would this event disrupt any food or, nutritional requirements that I have, and how can I prepare for that? Would this event disrupt any energy uses that I have, and how can I prevent or prepare for that? And supplies. What supplies would I need to survive this event? So you just go through it the same way you would for if you're preparing for a certain amount of time. And then that way when you come up on something and you say, oh, do I need to pay to put a well in my backyard? And say, well, My strategy is basically just to prepare for a earthquake or a hurricane, so it's very unlikely that I'll need a well in my backyard. So 5 gallons of water is fine for my plan. Now, like I was saying, I don't think that's the best plan, but if that is your plan, at least make it coherent and make it across the board. And that will affect your decision making. It will have you save a lot of money, and you won't have any of these preparedness dead ends sort of, that you're just doing this because you came up with a what if scenario. The next would be the level of self-sufficiency that you're trying to attain. And this self-sufficiency, for me, doesn't really make sense unless you're going for almost full self-sufficiency or very close to it, because otherwise you're just as reliant on the grid and the natural infrastructure as someone who has stockpiles for 60 days. You're actually just giving yourself more work. As an example of that, I'll use myself. My plan is to have 6 months of preparedness for 2 people. So it doesn't really make any sense for me to have like the chickens like I do. At least not for preparedness purposes. I like having the chickens. It's fun and everything. It doesn't really save you money unless you're eating a lot of eggs and you have a lot of chickens. I mean, it's certainly cheaper than getting the super organic eggs, but according to my plan for 6 months of self-sufficiency, it doesn't make sense really to use chickens as part of the preparedness plan, because I could just easily store what I need for 6 months. It doesn't make sense to store chicken food and then try to convert that into eggs when I can just store the powdered egg material, which I do have, and instead. So in that sense, the chickens are totally unnecessary for from a preparedness standpoint, since my strategy is to be prepared for 6 months. And it seems like a lot of people's self-sufficiency or supposed self-sufficiency is like this, where even if you're, where you're quote-unquote self-sufficient in one area, but not really overall. And being self-sufficient in one area isn't really any better than just storing stuff in that area, because your chain is only as strong as its weakest link, as they say, and your self-sufficiency is only as good as your weakest area. So if you're totally dependent on going to the feed store, once a month or once every 2 months or whatever, then your little farm isn't as self-sufficient as it seems, because all you're really doing is, you're no different than the regular person who has to go to the store twice a week or twice a month. But you just have all that extra work to do to pretend like you're self-sufficient, because the other guy only has to go get stuff for himself. You still have to take care of all these animals, and when it comes down to it, you're still dependent on the store just as much as this other guy is. So for that reason, I think that it's self-sufficiency as a preparedness standpoint is not as effective as most people think, simply because you have to get to such a high level of self-sufficiency to really be prepared. I mean, think about the level of self-sufficiency you would have to go to not have to go to the store for 2 or 3 years, And if you have to go, even if you got to the point where you have to go to the store only once a year, or twice a year, once every 6 months, then you're really no different than I am with my storing stuff for 6 months worth of supplies, except you have a lot more work to do, because you have to live out in the rural area with a homestead, you have to take care of your animals, you have to worry about all that nonsense too. So you're actually the exact same level of preparedness, which is you have to go to the store once every 6 months, and you've just got a lot of extra shit in between you and the goal, of being prepared. So if that's your thing, if living the Amish lifestyle, the homesteading thing, if that's what you want to do, then by all means do it. But if you're looking at it from a preparedness standpoint specifically, self-sufficiency, you're not reliant on going to the store, then you really need to look at what your strategy is. And I think for most vast majority of people, it makes sense to have the time-oriented preparedness strategy. So just to summarize everything I've saying, in case you guys fell asleep while I was rambling, it's very important to come up with a coherent strategy for your preparedness. And this is a mission statement or a commander's intent, you may want to call it, that will guide all your decision makings for your preparedness. And that way it's very easy to tell if you should or shouldn't do something or buy something. It's very easy to not have to purchase certain things or not have to do things certain ways and not be worried about it, because it's very easy to tell whether or not this supports your preparedness ideology. And a lot of people haven't done this, so they fret a lot over, should I do this? Am I prepared in this area? And then the things that they're not worried about, they ignore because they haven't focused on a specific strategy. Whereas even if, water isn't your thing, you're more interested in guns and solar power, if you have your strategy of 6 months, it's very easy to tell what you need to do to get to that level of preparedness. So it takes a lot of the guesswork out of preparedness, because it's much easier for even the layperson to figure out what they would need to do to be prepared for a certain amount of time than it is to just them to figure out on their own if they think they're prepared enough without even really knowing what enough is for them. So if you guys have some comments, leave them down there what your strategy is. If you haven't come up with one, I recommend that you do that, or a mission statement, and go ahead and post that either here on the YouTube when this is posted on YouTube or on rulethewasteland.com. I'd be interested to see what everyone's strategy is out there. If you thought about it like this before, or if maybe this is a new concept for you, let me know either way. And I will talk to you guys later. This is Rule the Wasteland Podcast.